It would be easy to assume that during the early Middle Ages it was a very male centric world, and largely it was. But there were women who were able to leave a significant impression on history, even in those days, including Athelflaed, Lady of the Mercians. But there were also women who were a bit more rebellious, women who created scandal. Here we look at three such women. Firstly, Queen Edba. Otho of Mercia was one of the mightiest kings in early English history, with his career seeing him form strong personal ties with Charlemagne. Offa's daughter, Edba, would also come to know Charlemagne well, but in a very different sort of way. Edba married Beorhtric, King of Wessex, whom she rather dominated. Becoming very used to and fond of power, Edba grew jealous of anyone who became too powerful or was held with too much affection by her husband. If she couldn't persuade Beorhtric to banish her enemies, then Edba would turn to poison to get her own way. In 802, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles records that Beorhtric and an ealdorman named War passed away, and it is possible that these two deaths were related. Edba had been plotting to do away with another of her enemies, a young favourite of her husband who may well have been War, when her plan went badly wrong. Edba tried to have the king's favourite banished, but this time Beorhtric's affection was too strong, and he refused. So Edba added poison to a drink that she intended for War only, assuming that it was War who was involved. But, to her dismay, Beorhtric took the drink first, and, having passed it then to War, who also sipped from it, both men fell ill and died. There is no doubt that Edba did not intend for her husband to die as well. She was a queen and liked it that way, but her plotting and scheming would prove her downfall. The people of Wessex were outraged, and Edba, collecting as many of her treasures as she could gather, crossed the English Channel into exile, where she would meet and greet the great man himself, Charlemagne. It seems as though the court of Charlemagne is where Edba had intended to go all along when she fled from Wessex, and ironically enough, it had been at Charles's court where the man who would succeed Beorhtric as King of Wessex, Egbert, had also found refuge when he had been driven into exile by Edba's father, Offa, and Beorhtric. The treasures that Edba had gathered, she hoped, would come in handy as she attempted to bribe Charles into arranging a great marriage for her. But Edba was underestimating Charles's shrewdness. It was put to Edba whom she'd rather marry, the Emperor himself or one of Charles's sons who had also been brought to meet her. Having lavished presents on Charles, Edba became overconfident and rather impertinently stated that she'd take the son due to his age. Basically, Edba had just told Charlemagne, one of the great men of his age, that he was too old for her to consider marrying. After that, unsurprisingly, Charlemagne dismissed any idea of arranging a marriage for Edba into his family, although he still treated her with kindness. Edba eventually became a nun and was granted by Charles a large abbey, which perhaps may have been enough for some women at the time, but it wasn't for Edba. She rather predictably created further scandal, this time with her sexual escapades during her time as an abbess, leading to her inevitable expulsion. The religious life for Edba had simply proved too dull. But during her final years, Edba must have regretted her actions, not only as an abbess, but also when she was Queen of Wessex. Her final days were spent in want and misery, quite unbecoming for a woman who was the daughter of the mighty King Offa, had attempted to negotiate with the even mightier Charlemagne, and who had certainly become used to a life of luxury. Judith of Flanders. In 855, King Athelwulf of Wessex made the long pilgrimage to Rome. Alongside him was his young son Alfred, who had already made this journey earlier in his childhood when he was escorted by English nobles rather than his father. On the return home, Athelwulf stopped off at the court of the Frankish king Charles the Bald, who was a grandson of Charlemagne. Athelwulf's wife, Osburh, Alfred's mother, seems to have died by this point, and so Athelwulf went in search of a new wife, and Charles the Bald would provide the King of Wessex with his desired bride. That bride was Charles's daughter, Judith of Flanders, who was just a young girl, probably not even in her teens at the time of her marriage to Athelwulf. Athelwulf, at the time, was at the very least in his mid-40s and possibly in his 50s. Young Judith joined her husband as he crossed over the English Channel, where he soon found that he had problems in his kingdom. Another of the king's sons, Athelbald, had conspired against his father whilst Athelwulf had been away, hoping to seize the kingdom for himself. Although Athelbald had a good deal of support for his plot, his father was nonetheless greeted with great warmth by most of his subjects. Athelwulf, perhaps sensing that time was catching up with him, decided to compromise with Athelbald and divided Wessex into two, with Athelwulf taking the east of Wessex, whilst Athelbald ruled over the west. Judith was given due respect by Athelwulf, who allowed her equal rank and to sit alongside him on the throne. Although this went against common convention at the time, the nobles, who were still under Athelwulf's rule, accepted it without question. Athelwulf died in early 858 when Judith was aged about 13 or perhaps 14. What came next was an act of great scandal. Athelbald married Judith, who had so recently been his own stepmother. Chroniclers like Asa, the biographer of Athelbald's brother, Alfred the Great, were outraged, and Asa described the marriage as incurring much infamy from all who heard of it. Naturally, Athelbald's reputation suffered as a result, and his reign was described as 2 years of lawlessness. Although, even if Athelbald had ruled well, the chroniclers would certainly not have acknowledged that, such was their disgust for his marriage to Judith. As for young Judith, how responsible was she for the marriage? Well, she was only a young girl in a foreign land, whose customs she had perhaps only just become used to, and it would seem the obvious answer to say that Judith had little say in the matter. But this would not be the last time that Judith was involved in great scandal. Following the death of Athelbald in 860, Judith's next moves were described in a chronicle, which says, Judith sold the property that she had acquired in Wessex and returned to her father, who sent her to a monastery, where Judith was to remain under his royal protection and episcopal guardianship, with all the honour due to a queen, until such time as, if she could not remain chaste, then she might marry in the way the apostle said, that is, suitable and legal. However, whilst Charles was making preparations for his daughter's future, Judith took matters into her own hands. Charles now learned that Judith had put off her widow's clothing and gone off with Count Baldwin of Flanders, at his instigation and with her brother's, Louis's, consent. Charles was not amused when he heard this, and Judith and Baldwin were forced to seek refuge with, of all people, the Vikings. Eventually they took themselves off to Rome, where Baldwin and Judith pleaded with the Pope to intervene on their behalf. Eventually Charles relented, and the couple were formally married. Given the assertiveness of Judith's actions at this point, I think it seems likely that she perhaps had encouraged her marriage to Athelbald in 858, and she was eager to retain her status as a queen after the death of Athelwulf. Judith of Flanders was clearly a determined woman. Gwendrith, a Mercian princess. We end with a brief story that is more legend than fact. Gwendrith was an 8th and early 9th century Mercian princess whom, according to Florence of Worcester, was hardened by ambition. So ambitious was Quendreth that she would stop at nothing to get what she wanted, which perhaps was the Mercian crown. That, says Florence, even meant murdering her own brother, Kenelm, who was only 7 years old, if Florence's version of events are true, which there is a good chance they are not. Having succeeded his father as king of Mercia, little Kenelm was lured into a wood, where he was set upon by his guardian, Aesbert, whom had been sent by Quendreth to murder Kenelm. The young king's head was cut off, after which a white dove could be seen flying to heaven. What became of Quendreth is unsure, and what should be noted again is that this story is closer to fiction than fact. Even if he was martyred, Kenelm was certainly not 7 years old when he died, and more likely he was in his mid-30s. The key takeaway from this story is that there were ruthlessly driven women in the time of the Anglo-Saxons, and sometimes they would go to great lengths to keep or take power.